They didn't break you, so they branded you. Crazy, too sensitive, overreacting. The moment your truth became louder than their control, they reached for the oldest weapon in the book, your sanity. Pause the world for 10 seconds and ask yourself, when did defending your dignity start sounding like madness? Maybe it was the night you finally said no, and the room froze. Maybe it was the day you named the elephant and everyone swore it was a ghost. Maybe it was the instant your laughter returned and they labeled it unstable, because joy that's no longer dependent on them is dangerous. You felt the shift. Admiration curdled into accusation, affection warped into suspicion. They couldn't steer you anymore, so they called you a storm. You know the pattern. Disagree? You're dramatic. Set a boundary? You're selfish. Speak facts? You're delusional. They don't need proof. They just need your doubt. Because once you doubt your own mind, you'll rent it out to theirs. Carl Jung wrote that what people repress in themselves, they project onto others. Your abuser's chaos lives best inside your hour of confusion. So they hand you their shadow, call it your reflection, and wait for you to accept the trade. The only thing they fear more than losing control over you is watching you control yourself. But tonight, something is different. You're listening with a fist unclenching inside your chest. You're piecing memories together that never made sense until this second. You're noticing the hush that fell whenever you stepped into clarity, because clarity is insurgent in a dictatorship. No, you were never crazy for wanting respect. You were never unstable for refusing to be edited. Your tears were data. Your anger was a boundary, not a breakdown. Your questions were the first bricks in a road that led out of the maze. What if the diagnosis you feared is actually the declaration you needed? Too sensitive means you still feel. Good. Overreacting means the alarm in your body works. Good. Impossible means you no longer fold on command. Excellent. Every label they used to shrink you can become evidence that you outgrew their cage. Freedom is disorienting at first. Silence after sirens feels unnatural. You may wander the empty rooms of your life wondering if you made all this up. Here's your grounding truth. People who benefit from your confusion will always weaponize your clarity. Memorize it. Tattoo it on the inside of your eyelids. Walk with it like armor. Breathe. Feel the spine you thought was a myth. Hear the pulse you once muted to match someone else's rhythm. Notice how reality doesn't collapse when you stand in it alone. If this narration found the part of you that was secretly screaming, "I'm not crazy," stay. Hit subscribe, not for another video, but for a mirror you can return to when the gaslight flickers again. Drop a comment with just one word, awake, and watch how many strangers echo back. Share this with a friend who's begun to whisper doubts about their own sanity, because a single candle exposes more darkness than 1,000 arguments. Tonight, let this channel be that candle. And the next time they call you crazy, remember, madness is the name weak hearts give to untamed souls. Wear it like a crown and keep walking.
They called you crazy because they needed a name for something they couldn't understand, because it was easier to dismiss you than to sit with the discomfort you triggered in them, because your depth felt like a threat to their surface, because your truth made their lies harder to swallow. You became the mirror they didn't ask for, the reflection of what they buried. And that was unforgivable in a world addicted to numbness. There's something about a person who refuses to shrink, who doesn't apologize for seeing what others pretend isn't there. Someone who walks into a room and makes it impossible to keep lying. That kind of presence is unsettling. Not because it's wrong, but because it's rare. You were never crazy. You were awake in a sleeping world. You were bleeding in a place that punishes honesty. You were sensitive in a culture that worships the mask. But when you began to ask deeper questions, when you said, "No, this doesn't feel right," when you cried over things they told you to ignore, they didn't know how to hold that. So they tried to make you hold their fear instead. They called you unstable when your intuition whispered what they weren't ready to hear. They called you dramatic when your soul tried to scream the truth. They called you weak when you chose softness over cruelty. They called you too much when they could barely handle themselves. But you weren't too much. You were what they had forgotten. You were the part of them that still felt, still cared, still hoped. You reminded them of something they had traded for comfort, and that made you dangerous. There's something about a Krager who sees through the veil, because once you know, you can't unknow. Once you see, you can't unsee. And once you feel the depth of what's beneath the surface, nothing shallow will ever satisfy you again. It's a kind of spiritual loneliness, not because you're broken, but because you're whole in a fractured world. You feel things others numb. You hold space where others fill it with noise. You listen to silence and hear the truth behind it. You watch people laugh and feel the sadness they're hiding underneath. You don't play pretend, and that is threatening. Because this world has built an empire on pretending. Pretending to be fine, pretending to belong, pretending to agree, pretending to love what we secretly hate, pretending we're happy in cages we've decorated with comfort. You weren't crazy. You were the interruption. The one who didn't clap at the performance. The one who asked, "But what do you really want?" The one who couldn't smile and say, "I'm fine," when your heart was breaking. The one who walked away, not out of weakness, but because your soul refused to rot. And yet, the more you honored your truth, the more they tried to silence it. They mistook your solitude for failure, your tears for regression, your boundaries for selfishness, your healing for arrogance. But healing changes your frequency, and people committed to avoiding their wounds will hear your peace as noise. They'll feel your growth as judgment. They'll see your light as a threat. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you've stepped out of the illusion they still need to survive. And so they'll label you. They'll call you difficult, unstable, rebellious, disrespectful, delusional, dangerous, because your presence alone dismantles their comfort. But what they don't understand is the names they gave you were never about you. They were shields for themselves. Crazy is a label we use when someone breaks the script, and you broke it. You burned it. You said, "I refuse to live this way." And they called it insanity. But maybe the real madness is staying quiet when your soul is screaming. Maybe it's building a life that looks perfect on the outside, but feels like a slow death every day. Maybe it's repeating the same pattern for decades just to avoid facing a single childhood wound. Maybe it's calling that normal and calling you crazy for wanting something different. You didn't lose your mind. You reclaimed it. You pulled it back from the stories you were told, from the guilt that was never yours, from the shame passed down like inheritance. You said no. You walked away. You broke free. And in doing so, you gave others permission to do the same. They won't always thank you for it. Some will resent you. Some will ghost you. Some will try to pull you back. But that's not your burden to carry. Your job is not to convince them. Your job is not to shrimp to make others comfortable. Your job is not to explain why your soul chose expansion. Your job is to keep going. Even when it's lonely, even when it's misunderstood, even when the old world calls you names. Because that loneliness, it's the sacred space between who you were and who you're becoming. And in that space, you are not lost. You are being reformed. There's a strength in you now. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady, unshakable. You've seen too much to go back, felt too much to be numb again, learned too much to pretend. And that is the beginning of a different life. Let them call you crazy. Let them misunderstand. Let them roll their eyes and whisper behind your back. None of that matters now. What matters is that you listened to your own voice, to your own body, to the whisper in the silence, to the God in your stillness. And when you chose truth over comfort, healing over performance, authenticity over approval, you didn't lose anything that was meant for you. You became what you were always meant to be: whole, free, unshakably real.
There's a moment, so quiet, so fleeting, that most people miss it. It happens in the pause between chaos and calm, in that eerie stillness where the world no longer hurts, but also no longer feels alive. You breathe, and for a second you think, this must be peace. But if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night with a tightness in your chest that you can't name, if you ever smiled while something inside you quietly screamed, if you ever walked away from pain so old, so familiar that losing it felt like losing yourself, then you know what I'm about to say. You didn't find peace. You found numbness. And you called it peace because it was the first time you weren't being torn apart. But silence is not the same as safety. And not hurting is not the same as healing. Somewhere deep within you, there's a part that stopped expecting love to feel warm, that began to equate quiet with comfort and absence with mercy. Not because you were weak, but because the chaos lasted so long, you forgot what safety was even supposed to feel like. You didn't just adapt. You survived by forgetting. You erased the blueprint of what real love and peace looked like. You stopped flinching, not because the blows stopped coming, but because your body got tired of reacting. You learned to breathe in shallow rhythm, to laugh with half your heart, to rest in states of alertness so constant they became your normal. And the most tragic part? You stopped noticing it. You stopped realizing you were still in the war. Because no one told you that trauma has an afterlife. That pain doesn't always scream, it often whispers. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And isn't that what so many of us have done? We mistook survival for serenity. We wore stillness like armor. We called it peace because we no longer had the energy to call it anything else. But real peace, it doesn't feel like hiding. It doesn't feel like tensing every time someone raises their voice. It doesn't demand that you shrink so others can feel big. It doesn't feel like walking on eggshells inside your own skin. Real peace feels like space, like breath, like warmth returning to places inside you that you forgot were cold. But here's the part no one talks about. When you finally start feeling safe again, your first instinct is to reject it. You'll call it boring, unreal, suspicious. You'll look for the catch, the trap, the flaw. Because when danger was your normal, safety feels like a lie. And you'll sabotage it, not because you want to suffer, but because suffering became the language you spoke fluently. And love? Love became something you needed to earn rather than receive. So when someone shows you kindness, you'll wonder what they want. When life gives you ease, you'll wait for the price. When you finally feel calm, you'll panic, because calm was never the end of the story for you. It was the part that came right before the storm. And so many people return to the very chaos they escaped, not because they're broken, but because it feels familiar. Because somewhere inside the belief formed, if I'm not suffering, I must not be paying my dues. That is the echo of trauma. That is the shadow Jung spoke of, the parts of the self we bury only to meet again in the mirror of our relationships, in the silence of our nights, in the choices we can't explain. But here's the truth that can set you free. You are allowed to feel safe. You are allowed to unlearn survival. You are allowed to stop scanning the room for danger and start looking for beauty instead. You are allowed to call gentleness home. Because you were not born to live in tension. You were not born to prove your worth through endurance. You were not made for war, you just learned to live in one. And the healing doesn't begin when things get quiet. It begins when you notice that you don't flinch anymore. When you stop bracing for impact. When you realize that the people around you aren't holding knives. When silence no longer feels like punishment, but like peace. Real peace feels foreign at first. It may even feel wrong, because trauma convinces you that chaos is the price of being alive. But you are allowed to choose again. And if you're still here, listening, breathing, aching, that means you can choose again. Even if you don't know how, even if it feels scary, even if part of you still clings to the chaos like it's a friend. You are not the war you survived. You are not the patterns you repeated. You are not the version of yourself that had to endure what they did to get here. You are something deeper, wider, more whole than you remember. And that part of you, the part that never stopped hoping, never stopped reaching, that's the part that knows. Peace doesn't have to be a stranger. It can become your native tongue again.